You are listening to the Intelligent Racer Podcast, where we look to educate and entertain the endurance racing community through discussions with racing professionals and elite age groupers.
In today's episode of the podcast, I speak with triathlon coach and elite amateur Marni Sumbal. We reflect on her 2017 season, which recently included some very high and low moments. Along the way, she shares many useful training and racing tips. I hope you enjoy. Marni, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing today?
I am good. How are you doing? Getting any sleep these days?
Not a lot. Thanks for asking, though. For those who aren't aware, I just had a newborn, so it's keeping me busy. Harder than triathlon training and stuff. So.
Oh, I bet so.
So, Marni, I wanted to, first of all, welcome you back to the podcast. You've been on before, and your husband, Carell, was on again. So, I think folks are probably familiar with you from the podcast. But your 2017 season was quite remarkable. But let's talk about the latest block of races. So, I want to start off with the World Championship, the 70.3 World Championship in Chattanooga. And, you went into it. I mean, this was a season where you were focused on that distance, the half Ironman distance, and you went into it with probably high expectations. It's one of the big races of the year. For those not familiar, what happened and how did you handle it?
Yeah, thanks for asking. Taking me back to a few weeks ago, it was a really tough weekend. And first off, just to kind of set the tone, is I dedicated this year to have a break from the Ironman distance. I've completed 11 of them and wanted to take a break just to be able to focus on the half Ironman distance and stretch my comfort zone, try some different styles of training. And I was just really looking forward to this big in-season goal for the 70.3 World Championship. It was actually my first World Championship at this distance. And I felt really good on race week. And then on the day before the race, it just felt a little off. And on race day morning, I got up out of bed pretty quickly because I didn't want to wake up Carell, who was sleeping. My husband Carell was sleeping so that he could rest for his race on Sunday because the women raced on Saturday. And so I got out of bed pretty quickly, and then I bent over, picked up my race clothes, and then kind of rushed into the bathroom so that I could shut the door and be quiet. And I went to the bathroom and I went to wash my face. And the next thing I remember is that I was on the kitchen floor and I had some blood coming from my lip and my face was pretty beat up. So it ended up that I fainted on race day morning, and it was very scary, but I wasn't really sure what happened. And of course, Carell was very worried about it as well. So we made the decision after about an hour of me trying to figure out what was going on for me not to race that morning. So it was my first did not start finish, and it was definitely a tough one.
Right. And I mean, I think that there's an important lesson in terms of knowing that at some points, whether it's a DNS, not starting a race or not finishing a race, when there's a medical situation at hand, what you did is probably, very prudent and smart to do. I mean, we live on for another day and not take any risks, right?
Absolutely. And when you're in the moment of this type of situation, you're just kind of on this autopilot, which I think I was for the morning. I wasn't really paying attention to my body's signals. And so when I hit my face and then I kind of started to think about everything, I still wanted to race just because I was in that mode. And then I kind of calmed myself down a little bit. Carell helped me calm down. And then it was just the right decision.
Right. And I'll kind of ask you what's next in a second. But before we go there, I wanted to talk just a second about, you decided you're a longtime Ironman athlete. There's probably a lot of Ironman athletes listening to this podcast. And, you decided to focus the year on half Ironman. Can you just talk a little bit about why you did that? And, what I would imagine that's probably a smart thing to do periodically to kind of sharpen certain skills that you would not otherwise get if you just kind of continually did the same Ironman distance year after year.
Yeah, I love the Ironman distance. It really suits me well. It's not one of those distances that you can race often. The most I've ever raced in a year is 2. But I wanted the opportunity to race more. And I also wanted to make sure that I could take some risks in other races that are of a shorter distance and not have to worry about that upcoming Ironman and putting everything into that big distance event. So this just allowed me to race and to stretch my comfort zone for what I feel and go through in races without having to worry about that big distance race coming up. I really looked forward to the season, but of half Ironman distance racing, but deep inside of me, and I've mentioned this on my blogs as well, is that something was missing from me just because I really do love the Ironman distance.
Once you got medically clear to race and train again, then walk me through kind of your thought process around, how did you decide to do whatever you did next, which we'll talk about?
Yeah. Well, after Corral raced on Sunday, which he ended up having a fantastic race. He was 8th in his age group, and it was just so exciting to cheer him on and just put together such a great race after everything that happened. And I know that he was a little shook up on Saturday and just didn't even feel like he could race, but I was really happy with his race. And so after the race, it was just a crappy way to end the season. I did not want to end my season on this note, but the first things first was I needed to get myself checked out. And I had a lot of concerns. Is something wrong with my heart? Is something wrong with my brain? What's going on with my body? I was just very worried because if anybody knows me, my health is so important to me and I'm always focused on taking care of myself. So I had several doctor's appointments. I got my blood pressure tested and blood tests and an ECG and every type of test I could think of. And so they diagnosed me with a vasovagal syncope, which I think is just due to my menstrual cycle or my hormones. But I just didn't react quick enough to try to control myself when my blood pressure dropped. So thankfully, nothing was wrong. And so at that point, after I was diagnosed, or actually I should say prior to that, Corral and I had some discussions and we just thought, well, if everything comes out okay, I really shouldn't end my season on this note because I trained so hard and I'm in good fitness shape. And I actually felt okay after the race besides my face hurting from my fall. So Corral and I talked about the options and I was thinking about half Ironman distance just because that's what I focused my season on. And I really wanted to do something that was challenging just because I enjoy those type of harder courses, hillier courses. And the options just weren't that great for me. We would have to travel somewhere far and I just wasn't really getting excited about anything. And so then Corral threw in the idea, how about Ironman Kentucky? And I was like, oh, an Ironman distance. Well, that sounds like fun. And then I was like, well, they would be so expensive for me to go up to Ironman Kentucky and then it's several weeks away and I don't know if I really want to train. So then Corral mentioned, how about Chattanooga? And I was like, well, I do have some unfinished business there in Chattanooga.
Yeah.
And so the race was actually closed, but I looked online and there was the foundation entries that were still open. So more expensive, but definitely a way for me to get in. And we talked about it. And as soon as I got that okay from the doctor that I could go race again, I signed up. And after I signed up, that decision, it just felt right.
Right. And of course, Corral was also racing as well as many of your athletes that you coach as well, right?
Yes. So it just felt like a good decision because we were already going up there. I knew the area. I felt like the course suited me very well. And what better than to share it with 14 of our athletes that are racing along with Corral.
And so going into the race, so as you said, you've been focusing on half Ironman distance. You have a really, really in-depth base of 11 years of Ironman racing, and you obviously are an elite amateur athlete, but at the same time, you weren't focused on the Ironman distance. So going into the race, I mean, how did your training look? I mean, what was your longest bike and run going into it since you didn't really have any Ironman focused training?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, one of the reasons why I focused on the half distance is because I wanted to really spend the time this season working on my resilience and strength and putting a little bit more intensity into my training. I have a lot of endurance and my body is built for endurance, so I really didn't need to focus on endurance training, even for the half Ironman distance. And I think when a lot of athletes, they think about that Ironman distance, there's a tendency to think these long miles as a way to build endurance, but then they end up starting the race exhausted or depleted, or they feel like they want their life back because they've just been spending so much time to the sport of triathlon. And for me, going into Ironman Chattanooga, or I guess I should say the World Championship 70.3, most of my rides were about 3 to 3.5 hours. We did one long ride at one of our training camps, which was between 5 and 6 hours, but that included stops. And of course, it was at the pace of our campers and helping them out. The longest run that I did in over the summer would have to be races. So my longest run was 13 miles, which occurred on race day. And most of my training was about an hour 40, hour 50 of running with walk, stop, specific intervals. So I would say maybe 11 or 12 miles. So really the training volume was quite low, but actually this year I felt stronger than I've ever felt because we did so much more frequency training, more intensity training. And the only thing that really would have been different is if I was training for an Ironman, I just would have done more Ironman specific intervals towards the end of my training. And even for Carell, who did the Ironman, he also did not do a lot of high volume after he did Ironman Lake Placid in July. Most of his rides were around 4 hours, and his longest run was 13 miles, which was actually the World Championship, 70.3. And then he did one training run on the treadmill, which was about 2 hours. So I would say that both of us, because of this type of training, we just arrived very fresh. And I guess relative to many other athletes, undertrained for the distance.
So did you do anything, specific to, between the 70.3 that you didn't start in Ironman Chattanooga? I mean, obviously most people do a 2 to 3 week taper. You're now probably tapered a little bit going into the World Championship. So how did you manage that 2 week period of time going into the Ironman?
Yeah, my 2 weeks of Ironman training. Well, the first few days after the 70.3 World Championships, I was just nervous about exercising. And so I really didn't do a lot. I just kept the intensity very low and just listened to my body because I was getting I was having so many doctor's appointments, and I just didn't want to do anything if something was seriously wrong. And a lot of athletes, they get into this mindset where they either need to rest a lot from their previous training, or they go into panic mode where they need to validate or feel like they're ready with specific type of volume or paces. And so once I got that confirmation that my body was healthy, I just felt good training. And so I was just excited to just get back out there, and I was just getting more and more anxious to get out there and race. So I just slowly eased myself back into training because by then it was Thursday before race week. And that weekend, Saturday, I did a good 4-hour brick where I felt really good. It was about 3.5 hours of riding, a 30-minute run. And then instead of running on Sunday, I actually did another ride about 2.5 hours, just so that I could make sure that on race week I felt really good, fresh going into the race. And on race week, I just stayed really active, and I just trained with Carell so that we had a similar style of training. And I would say that this quote unquote taper going into the Ironman, I really enjoyed our race week training.
Right. And what were your expectations, going into the race? Obviously, you're a competitive athlete. You podium at a lot of races, but this is a weird situation, right? You didn't have a lot of specific training for the race. It came out, you signed up 2 weeks before. Did you sort of temper your expectations, or were you going in as normal?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I found myself thinking about that a lot. And it was very odd, these waves of emotions that I felt before the race, because part of me was like, oh, this is going to be great. I'm doing an Ironman. Maybe I could try to win my age group and I could be on the podium. And then another side of me was like, Marni, that's crazy. You didn't really train for this. You should just be happy you're out there and you'll just go out there and have fun. But then another side of me was, well, I'm doing an Ironman. I need to be competitive. So there was definitely a lot of back and forth thoughts. But I think that the best thing that I thought about was not having a plan, not making expectations, and just going into the race with my experience as an Ironman athlete and knowing that the run course was going to be hilly. It was going to be very hot when we got to the run. I just was looking forward to going through the motions, doing what I do best at the distance, and really just enjoying the day. I think I had a smile on my face all day long just because I was out there doing what I love to do. But I never imagined that the race would turn out as it did, just because I was really just passionate all day long and using my experience and wisdom and knowledge of what I know about this distance to just take care of myself mile after mile through the entire race.
Oh, we haven't said yet how the day went. So, so for those who don't know the result, Marni, you finished the top female amateur in the race. Obviously, won your age group, but beyond that, you were number one overall for amateur women. So, an incredible result. So, just talk a little bit about how the race went. I mean, did anything feel different because of the lack of Ironman specific preparation? Did you have to adjust anything mid race or?
Yeah, it was pretty incredible. I have to thank my body for this one, for my very first amateur overall win. So what an amazing day. And Karel ended up placing as the second overall amateur, and he also won his age group. So it was very special for both of us. As far as the day went, to be honest, and I don't want to downplay the Ironman distance as it's some easy event that you can just sign up for a week or two before the race. But honestly, nothing surprised me about the day. I actually felt strong all day. And I think it was back to our conversation that we had earlier, where just all of the endurance and the consistency really allowed me to feel prepared for this distance, even though I didn't have the miles that a lot of athletes think that they need going into an Ironman distance event. I never really felt tired. I didn't feel that fatigue that I've even felt in past Ironmans at certain times. I didn't really have a lot of low moments aside from what I would consider as just normal. And then I just kind of dealt with the conditions. It did get tough on the run, and I just had to adjust, but I feel like I managed the heat well. I managed my nutrition well. I didn't have a pacing plan, so it gave me a lot of freedom that I wouldn't be disappointed if there was a time I was thinking of and I didn't see that time. So it was really great to just be able to be out there and just enjoy the day without any hurdles. I did mention in my blog that I dropped 2 bottles, which I've never lost nutrition on the bike before, so that was a learning experience. I adjusted, used on-course nutrition until I got to special needs. But when I heard that I actually heard that I was leading my age group by a big margin, about 16 or 17 minutes when I got onto the run. But to be honest, I never really thought about it, just because in an Ironman, you just have to keep taking care of yourself. So much can happen in those later miles. So I never tried to get overly confident with myself. And at the same time, I also wasn't really thinking, wow, this is cool. I just signed up for this last minute. I was just in competition mode, focus on one step at a time and just taking care of myself. So I think everything I just processed when I got to that finish line. I really didn't have enough energy to really think about it during the marathon.
Right. Well, congratulations. I was tracking the race all day, and both you and Karel did amazing. And, it's really exciting. So, I mean, from this experience, will this change anything about your approach going into future Ironmans, or change your coaching philosophy at all? Or maybe it validates it, but it seems like, you went in, quote unquote, undertrained or whatever, versus some people who would do this massive amount of Ironman training. But you said you felt fresh, you felt strong all day. It sort of validates that you don't need to do these massive 120, 130 mile bikes and massive runs off them to be successful, right?
Yeah, I don't think that I will change a lot in my training. I will do, now that I'm focusing on the Ironman distance again next year, I will do more Ironman specific workouts where the intervals may reflect that Ironman intensity. And we will do some longer workouts, but that will mostly be on the bike. And because our terrain is so challenging where we live, it's very hilly and technical, our miles go by very slowly here on the bike. So we don't really need to ride the hours that we would need to accumulate for the same amount of stress on flat terrain. So I would imagine that next year, most of my rides will probably be between 4 and 4.5 hours, as opposed to the 3 and 3.5 hours. But I will say, though, that as far as running goes, the risk of injury with running is so great. And then when you get injured, it can take away from swimming and biking. And I really have learned that frequency running, so splitting up long runs or doing several runs in a row or the brick runs, has been so much more beneficial to my body and our athletes as well, because we've experimented with them. And so I really don't see myself doing longer runs in my Ironman specific training. I feel very comfortable capping my run distance around an hour 45, because otherwise my form starts to go and it's hard for me to recover from that workout.
Right. No, yeah, that definitely makes sense. And I can concur, because I followed the same thing this past season under your guidance. So it definitely does work and keeps the body from being too beat up. So, you know, as a coach, though, I mean, you know, you mentioned, you know, you had 14 other athletes in the race. Do you like racing when your athletes are in the race? You know, I mean, obviously you get to see them on the course. Is it hard to sort of be, you know, coach and athlete at the same time? And how do you manage that?
That's a great question, and one that I've always asked myself. And, you know, we all know those coaches out there that aren't athletes anymore, and they're really there on the sidelines helping their athletes get to the finish line. But I still feel like I have so much more to learn about this sport, and what better than to be in it myself, doing it with my athletes and making mistakes and sharing my successes with others. And truthfully, once our athletes are out on the course, there's really not much more we can do for them. So we hope that we've given them all the tools that we can to put together a really good race. But it's really exciting for me, and I think it's one of the reasons why I still love this sport so much, is seeing familiar faces out on the course. It was really fun for me to see our athletes out on the course and to give them a high five or to cheer them on. And we've also heard from our athletes, which is very nice, that they tell us that they like seeing us. Maybe they like seeing us suffer, but they like seeing us out there on the course as well, as it's motivational to our athletes. So it's really enjoyable. But I will say we do give a lot of our time before the race. Corel may be fixing their bikes if there's an issue. I may be going over some nutrition if somebody has a question. We always do a pizza party and a pre-race talk before our races, our key races 2 days before. And then Corel and we will stay at the finish line and watch all of our athletes finish until everyone makes it to that finish line. So we do make sure that we're there for them before and after the race.
Right. And you obviously, you mentioned Corel, and you before mentioned that he was the second overall amateur, first in his age group, had an incredible day. And so, you don't always race in the same race together, but a lot of times you do. And so, how does that kind of go for you all? I mean, first of all, Corel and you have different racing styles, I would say, in terms of personality and the way you focus and kind of, way you manage the course and things, but, both are super successful, great people and, and great coaches. But, how does that kind of relationship work in race? And also, what happens when you see each other on the course? And, I know he's kind of heads down focused in his zone. So does he even acknowledge that you're there?
Yeah. If anybody knows us, we do have two different racing styles. I'm usually the one with a thumbs up and smiling, and Corel, it's hard to read him during a race. If you get a thumbs up or a smile out of him, I would go buy a lottery ticket today.
Yeah.
But it's funny because we both feel very confident with each other's abilities at the Ironman distance. So as far as that relationship goes, where we may worry about one another, although we do want each other to have a good day and we hope for the best, we don't really think about that one of us isn't going to finish or that something is going to happen to each other on race day. So we do have confidence in each other. And also when you're racing this distance, you really get so involved in the race and focusing on the process that it's just hard to think about anything else. So actually I've gone the whole race where I'm not even, or parts of the race where I'm not thinking about Corel. I forget that he's also racing. And actually in this race, I forgot to mention to my friend that was out on the course cheering for us, I completely forgot to ask her, how's Corel doing? So I didn't even know for half of the run how he was doing. And I was really interested in his race. But there are times when I'm racing and I just kind of think about Corel. I wonder how he's doing, or I wonder how he's feeling right now. But when we see each other, which in Chattanooga was kind of hard because we never saw each other after the swim. So that was a different experience, because usually when we're out there, it's maybe a looped course or we cross paths. But this race, we never saw each other until the finish line. But for when we see each other and maybe cross paths in a race, we usually give each other a smile or a thumbs up. I'm usually the one cheering for him, and we just kind of have this nonverbal communication where it's like, all right, keep going. You're doing great.
Yeah.
We can just kind of see it within each other's eyes. But I will say, and it's kind of funny, that Corral is usually about 40 to 60 minutes faster than me. And so there have been times when I've seen him on the course and I'm excited to see him, and then I see him turning and going straight to the finish line, and I still have another 6 miles left to go. So sometimes I get a little bit jealous and bitter at him that he's so fast, but then I forget about it and try to get myself to the finish line.
Right. And, one of the things I've noticed this year between you two is the swim splits. He's been beating you by a couple seconds in these races, but in Chattanooga, you beat him, right?
Yes, I beat him by 5 seconds, and I'm very proud of that. And Corral does not come from a swimming background, whereas I do, but he's worked very, very hard on his swim. And I'm okay with us coming out of the water about the same, but I still want to have just that one discipline where I'm faster than him.
Do you, kind of a tangent question, but do you swim train together, doing the same sets and things? Because it seems like you're swimming basically at the same speeds. I'm just curious, is it that you're in the same pool doing the same stuff at the same paces?
Yeah, I would say about 98% of our swim training is together. And so we do similar sets together and swim next to each other. I do feel a little bit more comfortable in open water than Corral. He's comfortable in the open water, but I tend to swim a little bit better in open water than him. So I was really impressed with his swim at Chattanooga.
Right. And so going into this race, I know, Corral also raced Lake Placid, and we talked about that race on the podcast. And, this race, though, in Chattanooga was his race that he wanted to, he turned down the Kona slot in Placid for this year because he wanted to get a Kona slot for Chattanooga for next year. And he did that. You didn't have your eyes on Kona. You go in and you win first overall for women in your, in the race, and you get offered a Kona slot and you turn it down. It rolls down past you. So can you just talk about that decision a little bit? I know you sort of had your plans already set for next season, but that's a tough thing to do. Now, granted, you've competed in Kona multiple times, so maybe it's not as hard as someone who hasn't done it, but just talk about that thought process a little bit.
Yeah, I had made the decision in 2015 after Corral and I raced Kona that I wanted to take a break from racing in Kona. It's a very special event. I've raced it 4 times. My first time was in 2007. And I know that many athletes see Kona, it's that pinnacle of triathlon, that big stage, and they would do anything to get there. It's that big dream and goal. And it's actually how a lot of athletes even get in the sport and why they stay in the sport. And I really wanted to let someone else experience Kona. I'm so grateful for my time in Kona and all the experiences. It's such a special place. And I can't wait to go back next year as a spectator. Again, I spectated for Corral last year. But I really love the sport of triathlon. And I decided that I didn't want to dedicate my entire year to just one race, which would have been the Ironman World Championship. I love racing and I love traveling. And so I wanted to let someone else experience Kona, especially maybe if they've never experienced it before. And I do plan to go back and race Kona and compete there. But for now, I'm just really looking forward to racing on different venues.
Right. And speaking of Kona, it is shortly coming up on, for this year's race. So, just for, those who are going to either spectate or maybe they're there and listening to this, who knows, but you've had a lot of experience there, not only as a 4-time finisher, but also you watched Corral race there last year. I mean, what are some of the mistakes that you've seen on that course that, conditions are tough, they change, those types of things. But what are some of the mistakes and advice that you would give someone going into that race?
Yeah, there's just so many tips that I would give. It's just such an extreme event. I would say take away the wind and the heat, and you've got a course that I think is doable, is not too challenging. But you throw in these extreme conditions with the island, and it's a lot of unknown. You know it's going to be hot, you know it's going to be windy, but what exactly is it going to be like on that day? And then sometimes it changes. I really believe that the biggest mistake that athletes make is they abandon that winning formula or that recipe that got them to the race. And so a lot of athletes think, well, gosh, I'm going to a world championship and I need to upgrade this, I need to change this, I need to overhaul this, I need to do this differently. But really, you don't have to change a lot. You got to the race, so something worked to get you there. And so we like to say, treat it like any other race, but respect the race, respect the island, respect the distance. You don't want to race too hard and then end up underperforming, not being able to race to your abilities. So we want to avoid that last minute panic training or panic buying that ends up destroying the performance.
Right. And this year, NBC and Ironman announced that there's going to be some, TV coverage, live TV coverage of the race, which is new. And there's online streaming throughout the day. For someone who is not either has never done an Ironman or someone who's sort of new to the whole triathlon world, I mean, what you would recommend some of the things to look at, just to learn about the sport, whether it's, I don't know, watching the pros draft on the swim or something on the bike or run, anything to kind of just focus on from an educational perspective?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say if somebody is not a triathlete or maybe they're interested in the sport of triathlon, first of all, you don't have to do an Ironman to call yourself a triathlete. So be inspired by putting these three sports together because that's difficult as a multi-sport event. But I would look for the athletes, more of the motivational stories that really tells you that anything is possible. Anybody can do a triathlon, and you can really work your way up to an Ironman. The Ironman World Championship does represent the best athletes and the fittest athletes in the world, but I really do believe that it will inspire people to pursue their athletic dreams. Now, if somebody is a triathlete and they are in the sport, and regardless if they have an opportunity to race in Kona or not, but they enjoy the sport of triathlon, is to really focus on how the athletes fuel, how their form is. Because we don't see, we'll probably hear about it, but you don't see their watts or their paces. I'm sure we'll hear about it. But really, I would look at how they're performing, how their body is moving, because this is a trained body, and you can really look at how they flow from one sport to the next, and how they get through those challenging moments, which we may not know that they're having any challenging moments, but I can assure you that everybody's going into those deep, dark places throughout the race and somehow getting through them. I would also look at, if they do show it, I always am interested to see transition areas, transitioning from swim to bike and bike to run. And I also think that the dynamics of the race, where things are changing throughout the race. So you may think somebody's having a bad day, but maybe they're just saving their energy for later in the race, or maybe they're having a low moment. So that's also very interesting as well.
And one final question. So if I were to take out former champions, who would you say, prediction, if no former champion, if there's not going to be a repeat champion, because we obviously have Daniela Ryf and Jan Frodeno, who are, prohibitive favorites. They've dominated the last 2 years. Any athletes stick out in mind, or anyone you're rooting for particularly?
Well, I'm really excited to see Lucy Charles out there. I think she's going to really be exciting to watch in the swim. And so she's going to be fun to see out there, giving everybody a run for their money in the swim. And then I also think that Heather Jackson, from what it appears to look like, that she is really strong and excited for the race. But there's just so many. I love Michelle Vesterby. She just smiles all day, so I'd love to see her do well. But I'm really excited to see the women's race. I really believe that for the women's race, that for the top 10, that it's going to be more of a running race for the women. And I think for the guys, it's going to be more of a bike race, is going to really change things up. I think Lionel Sanders has done something incredible for the sport, and I would love to see him do well out there. And then I also think that Tio and Ben Hoffman, I really believe that they're hungry for the win. I also like Sebastian Kienle, so he's always one of my favorites.
Hey, he's a former champion. You can't put him on.
I know.
But yeah, it's going to be exciting. So I can't wait to watch. It's always a great time of year. So Marni, thank you so much for your time today, sharing your story, and just there's a lot to be learned from this story. So thank you for sharing it, and thank you for your time today.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to the Intelligent Racer Podcast. For more information on this and other episodes, please visit www.intelligentracer.com. Also, be sure to check us out on social media, and please review us on your podcast directory. Join us next time for another edition of the Intelligent Racer.